In my mind, this is the end game for the dollar. I don't know for sure if it's ever going to happen, but this is the most plausible theory that I can come up with in order to explain how the dollar can collapse or how the world can de-dollarize in spite of all that dollar denominated debt across the world. Now, half jokingly, I call this theory the whiskey theory.
I like it.
It's not the milkshake theory, it's the whiskey theory. Because once you realize what can possibly happen if all those dollars come home to roost, you're going to have to pour yourself a stiff drink in order to relax.
Absolutely. And luckily, we do have plenty of whiskey distilleries here in the US. Tennessee area is famous for those. So we got some here in the States that you could spend those dollars on too for that inflated
Definitely.
whiskey.
Yeah, whiskey is going to be a very good investment in coming years.
Well, since the beginning of the year, the DXY or US dollar index has dropped by about 10%, and it has just recently dropped under 100. Well, the DXY measures the strength of the US dollar by comparing it to six other major currencies. These currencies are the euro, the Japanese yen, British pound, Canadian dollar, Swedish krona, and Swiss franc. The DXY was initially created in 1973. So, what affects the DXY? Is it interest rates that the Fed puts out, the economy, job numbers, inflation? It does seem to me like right now, like global risk and geopolitics, possibly tariffs or fear of conflicts are driving it.
Yes. So the dollar index, as you've mentioned, is an index which measures the value of the dollar compared to other fiat currencies around the world. Now, it's mainly the euro. The euro consists more than 50% of that index. And then you have the Japanese yen and the British pound, which are also important. But basically, you're comparing the dollar to other fiat currencies. Now, notice that you're not comparing it to commodities. So when the dollar index rises, it means that the dollar is stronger compared to other currencies. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it has a higher purchasing power. The dollar index can strengthen as the dollar is losing purchasing power. And that is very important to notice. Just because the dollar index has been strong in recent years doesn't mean you don't have inflation. Now, that's
That is
the
a good
first,
point.
yeah, that's the first thing that you need to be aware of. And in recent years, we've seen it strengthen. It was stronger, it went above 100, and people thought it's going to continue going up. And the reason why it was stronger is because the Fed was tightening its monetary policy, raising interest rates, performing QT, which is the inverse of QE. It wasn't printing money. On the contrary, it was destroying money. It was like burning money. That's the meaning of QT, quantitative tightening. And so, the public believed that the dollar should be stronger compared to other currencies. But now the Fed is no longer tightening. And due to the current weakness in the markets, people are even suspecting that the Fed is going to start easing again. And so perhaps this is what's responsible for now the dollar weakness. But also, I think that the most reasonable explanation of why the dollar is now weakening is reduced demand across the world for financial assets such as stocks and bonds, American stocks and American bonds. Well, first of all, because, the stock market has been weak since the beginning of the year, so perhaps people are bailing out of the S&P 500 and then the Nasdaq, and also perhaps they're also selling American bonds because the Treasury needs to refinance a lot of debt. In the coming year, trillions of dollars need to be refinanced, probably at higher interest rates. And I'm guessing that there is a fear that the market is going to be flooded with new debt and the market value of that debt is going to drop. So I think people are just, bailing out of the bond market. And that's my best explanation as to why the dollar is weakening. They're selling those assets and using the proceeds, buying their local currency. So they're selling dollars.
That makes sense. And it does look like the Fed is going to do some easing. My understanding it's a pretty high likelihood that they'll do a rate cut this summer. Some are considering it like baked in at this point. And what's interesting is back in about 2001, well, over 70% of the central bank's reserve currencies were in US dollars, and that's dropped down to like about 59% today. So we already kind of see it trending that direction. The foreign governments are trying to get away from the dollar, and all this stuff that's going on with tariffs might just exacerbate that. It might just make it move along quicker.
Yeah.
Um,
So what's important to note is that the dollar index fell below the level of 100, which I think
okay,
is a critical level because, it's like this round number,
right.
which served as support in the past couple of years. And once you fall below, as though below the floor of 100, then it can accelerate. Potentially, I think the dollar index in the coming months or years, it can fall as low as 90 or even lower.
So
And that
another
means,
10% or maybe more from here.
yes, yes, I see, like technically speaking, there is the potential for that. And that is very problematic because we are currently expecting a surge in inflation due to the tariffs, by the Trump administration.
Right.
And if on top of that, you also get a weakening currency, that means you need more dollars in order to purchase the same products if they are manufactured abroad. So
Right. Absolutely.
that's another driver for inflation. So you get that double whammy of both having those tariffs and a weaker dollar. In the past 2 years, a strong dollar was, it reduced the amount of inflation that Americans felt. It is though gave them some kind of a reprieve because you needed fewer dollars in order to buy imported goods. And now it's going to be the reverse of that. It's going to be the reverse effect of having to pay more dollars in exchange for the same amount of foreign currency, the same amount of imported goods. So you get inflation both from tariffs and from a weaker dollar, and that's kind of dangerous.
I see. So the dollar, because it was strong, was kind of working as a counterbalance. And now that it's turned in the other direction, now it's like a double-edged sword for us.
Yes,
S-
exactly.
So that's kind of concerning. But yeah, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that.
Now, what's interesting to mention, in that regard, is what we call the milkshake theory. Now, this
Yes.
is this is a theory which was created and popularized by an analyst called Brent Johnson of Santiago Capital. And he's very active on Twitter, talking to people. I've had discussions with him in the past, and he has been arguing for a number of years now that the dollar index is destined to rise dramatically. And the reason for that, or the explanation that he gives, he argues that there is a dollar shortage
I
across the
see.
world.
Uh-huh.
Usually we are talking about, money printing here in the US, that the Fed prints money. We don't think of dollar scarcity as a thing.
No.
But yeah, but he argues that across the world, there is a scarcity of dollars. And the reason for that is that of the around $300 trillion worth of debt across the world, he argues that about a half of it is what we call dollar denominated debt. It's denominated in dollars. So all those corporations across the world owe dollars. And in order to service that debt or try to repay it, they need dollars all the time. There's this constant demand for dollars, by corporations across the world. And this is as though what is supporting the US dollar, giving it strength. Now, of course, when the dollar index, when it went above 100 and started surging, then everybody in the investment world started thinking, whoa, Brent Johnson was right. Look,
He was correct.
we're seeing the milkshake theory materializing before our very eyes. It's just happening. And he became very popular as a result. Yes, he was very popular in recent years. And personally, I never bought that theory. And I'm going to tell you why, because there's something a bit counterintuitive about it. Like, according to the milkshake theory, the world can never de-dollarize. You
Right.
understand? Do you
Yeah.
understand why?
Because they'll constantly have to be servicing this debt that's denominated in US dollars. So
Yes,
they want
yes, exactly. For instance, if you're a corporation from Indonesia and you've borrowed dollars in order to buy machines to produce underwear, to sell them in the US or in the European Union. And you owe dollars, then you constantly need more dollars to service that debt. And if you try to pay it down, what happens is, since we're living under this debt-based system, once you pay down debt, you as though destroy dollars. Dollars are created when you take debt and destroyed once you repay it. So if you try to get rid of that dollar denominated debt, you're as though reducing the amount of dollars in circulation and making them more valuable. You see?
because there's less of them.
Yes, because there's less of them. And so it becomes more and more difficult to pay down the debt. The more you try, the more difficult it becomes to pay down that debt. That's his main argument, that as though the world can never de-dollarize because that
Right.
debt is going to prevent it from happening. And to me, that's very counterintuitive because it as though means that the dollar will always be the global reserve currency, and there's nothing that foreign countries can do in order to change that.
Yeah, that's definitely what he was hinting at.
Yes, and it also means that you can never have a dollar collapse or a hyperinflation in the dollar because the moment people try to ditch the dollar, it becomes more expensive, it becomes more valuable. So it counteracts any inflation that you have here in the US, as though you can never, never have the dollar collapse.
The world is just going to be relying on US dollars till humanity ends.
Yeah, forever and ever. And no
Right.
matter how many dollars the Fed prints, the world is always going to take them because it constantly needs more dollars.
Right.
So
That's the
that's the
theory.
gist of it. That's the gist of the theory. And I always, I couldn't quite explain why, but I just didn't buy it because it doesn't make any sense to me that a country can print like unlimited amount of dollars and foreign countries will always take them, no matter how much you print.
Right. It doesn't make any sense to me either. I've never thought much of the dollar milkshake theory.
Yes. And then it dawned on me, not a long while ago, by the way, it dawned on me that there is an explanation, there is a way to settle this contradiction. And this is through the velocity of money. Yeah, I know it sounds a bit complicated, but it isn't. The velocity
Okay.
of money is simply the number of times in which those dollars exchange hands in any given period of time. For instance, look, I get paid, let's say in dollars, and I go out to a restaurant and I pay the restaurant with those dollars. And, the restaurant owners uses that money to, pay his suppliers. So every time those dollars exchange hands, that's like you count one, two, three times, and you measure how many times they exchange hands, let's say during a single year. So when you measure inflation or when you talk about inflation, you need to think not only about the quantity of dollars in circulation, but also about their velocity. Because when those dollars circulate faster, it feels as though there are more dollars in circulation. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, no, absolutely. Because if it's not just being held by a central bank as part of its reserves and they offloaded it and now there's more dollars in circulation, yeah, absolutely. It's effective. It's almost just like printing more money.
Yes. Now, a way in which you can think about it to, a way to illustrate it. Let's suppose that the Fed were to print like $1 trillion and just sit on them, shove them under the table and do nothing with them. Then it's as
Okay.
though they don't exist. You see what I mean? Like
Right.
officially they printed them, but if they're not in circulation, then they're not affecting the prices of goods and services.
Absolutely.
So this is as though money which has zero velocity.
Yeah, it's not changing hands at all.
Yeah. But if you take that money and you start, injecting it into the system, giving it to people who can actually use it to buy goods and services, to go to the supermarket, to pay their rent with it, to pay their utilities with it, suddenly it does affect inflation. Suddenly
Because
yeah, it starts
because there
bidding
is
up.
more.
Yeah, it starts bidding up the prices of all those goods and services. So the velocity is just as important as the money supply, as the quantity of dollars in circulation. And what economists do usually, they assume that the velocity is constant.
I see. Okay.
And I think that's a mistake. I think what we're seeing nowadays, or what we could see, is that if countries across the world lose faith in the dollar, and they start, try to ditch the dollar, what's going to happen is that the velocity is going to pick up. People are not going to want to hold dollars. I mean, even if they do get dollars in exchange for their products, they're going to try to get rid of it as quickly as possible. And this means that its velocity is growing faster and faster.
Right. Absolutely. That totally makes sense.
And so even if they pay down debt and the number of dollars in circulation is falling, but if the velocity is growing at the same time and growing even faster than they are paying down debt, then you could have the amount of dollars falling and yet the feeling, the effect of more dollars in circulation.
Right. And that's out of the Fed's control too. And a stated goal of the BRICS is to de-dollarize.
Yes.
I think all those countries saw us freeze the Russian assets and they all thought, we don't want to end up in the position like Russia is right now. So they are attempting to do this. And a lot of those dollars will get put back into the money supply and affect the velocity. That totally makes sense, what you're saying.
Yes. And so if you reach that point in time, you've said it correctly. If you reach that point in time in which people are trying to ditch the dollar and the velocity is picking up, then it's out of the control of the Fed because the Fed can increase or decrease the amount of dollars in circulation, but it cannot affect the velocity. And so even if they try to, contract the money supply as velocity is picking up, we can reach a point at which it doesn't help. And another point to consider is that if no one wants dollars, then they're going to end up back in the United States because this is the only place in the world in which corporations have to take dollars. They cannot refuse
Right.
to take dollars. So all the dollars which were exported, in recent decades are going to find their way back home. And it has the potential to generate such terrible inflation that we almost cannot imagine.
That's interesting. It definitely makes sense. I bet a lot of those dollars are going to find their way back to the United States. And a good way to prepare yourself for that would be to get some physical gold and silver.
Yes. And in my mind, this is the end game. for the dollar. I don't know for sure if it's ever going to happen, but this is the most plausible theory that I can come up with in order to explain how the dollar can collapse or how the world can de-dollarize in spite of all that dollar denominated debt across the world. Now, half jokingly, I call this theory the whiskey theory.
I like it.
It's not the milkshake theory, it's the whiskey theory. Because once you realize what can possibly happen if all those dollars come home to roost, you're going to have to pour yourself a stiff drink in order to relax.
Absolutely. And luckily, we do have plenty of whiskey distilleries here in the US. Tennessee area is famous for those. So we got some here in the States that you could spend those dollars on too for that inflated
Definitely.
whiskey.
Yeah, whiskey is going to be a very good investment in coming years.
Yes, that will be something that will make you want to have a stiff drink for sure. Well, I think that if the dollar index breaks down further, and let's just say it does go another 10% down or maybe a little more, like you're talking about, it seems to me like this will be really bullish for the metals. Why? Because people will want to access that store of value that silver and gold can provide. And when they're looking around, it looks like the stock market, isn't doing great, that there's only going to be so many places for them to park that money. And so it wouldn't surprise me if the dollar index does keep breaking down, if this will be bullish for the metals, and we will see some regular investors start moving into the gold and silver sector that potentially hadn't before.
Yes. I would also say that, since gold has become so volatile, it's been rising this way, perhaps it's trying to tell us something. Perhaps it's signaling that this process has already begun. Thank you for listening to the Silver Hermit podcast. If you like this content, please donate in the link which appears in the description below. Please subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends and family. Hit the bell icon to be notified whenever I release a new video. Remember, I'm not a licensed financial advisor. This video is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be regarded as investment advice. Before taking any investment decision, please consult with a professional financial advisor who may assess your personal investment objectives and needs.